The Soviet SA-2 Guideline missile had a minimum engagement altitude of roughly 3,000 feet. Below that, the radar couldn't track fast enough and the missile couldn't maneuver hard enough to achieve any meaningful kill probability. Soviet air defense doctrine in 1962 called this the dead zone, a thin layer of atmosphere where their most advanced surface-to-air system was functionally blind. The RF-8A Crusader lived in that dead zone. At 200 feet above the Cuban treeline, the aircraft was a different animal than its fighter variant. Vought had stripped the 420mm cannons out of the nose and replaced them with 5 camera stations, 2 forward-facing, 2 lateral, 1 vertical. The Ka-45 and Ka-46 cameras could resolve objects down to inches from low altitude, but only if the aircraft held steady at precisely the right speed and height. Too fast and the film blurred. Too slow and the Crusader became a target for something less sophisticated than a missile. Small arms, a lucky burst from a ZPU-4 anti-aircraft gun, a Cuban militiaman with a rifle and decent aim, even a tall power line at the wrong moment. The engine was a Pratt & Whitney J57-P-20A, producing 10,700 pounds of thrust dry and 16,000 in afterburner. Nobody used afterburner on a photo run. The heat signature alone would light up every infrared sensor on the island. So the Crusader came in at military power, somewhere around 450 knots, close enough to the ground that the pilot could see individual palm fronds whipping in the jet wash behind him. 5 cameras firing simultaneously, each frame covering a strip of ground roughly 800 feet wide. The shutter cycling so fast, the pilot could hear it through his helmet. Or said he could anyway. Sources differ on whether that's physically possible over the engine noise. I suspect it's one of those details that's emotionally true, if not acoustically true. But that's beside the point. What matters is what the cameras saw. San Cristobal, Pinar del Rio Province. October 23, 1962. The film showed Soviet MRBM sites in a state of rapid construction that the CIA's U-2 photographs from 60,000 feet had detected but couldn't characterize in detail. The U-2 images were good enough to confirm the presence of medium-range ballistic missiles. They were not good enough to tell President Kennedy whether those missiles were fueled, whether the warheads were mated, whether the sites were hours from operational capability, or days. The difference between hours and days was the difference between a naval blockade and an airstrike followed by invasion. The Crusader's cameras answered that question from 200 feet. Soviet technicians on the ground could see the aircraft. This is documented. They looked up and watched an American reconnaissance jet scream overhead at a height that, in any other context, would qualify as a crash in progress. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, already arrested by this point, already doomed, had provided enough intelligence about Soviet missile systems that the Americans knew roughly what to look for. But Penkovsky's information was weeks old at best. The low-level photography was minutes old. Fresh film. Wet chemistry. Answers. The pilot's name can wait. The mission designation can wait. The chain of command that authorized a single-seat, unarmed reconnaissance aircraft to fly into the most heavily defended airspace in the Western Hemisphere at an altitude where a tall tree was a navigation hazard. That can wait too. What can't wait is the absurdity of the tactical situation. The Soviets had deployed 24 SA-2 sites across Cuba, plus conventional anti-aircraft batteries, plus roughly 42,000 troops with personal weapons. They had built the most concentrated air defense network outside of Moscow. And the one aircraft they most needed to shoot down was flying underneath all of it, inside a sliver of atmosphere where none of those systems worked well. General Isa Pliev, commanding all Soviet forces in Cuba, had standing orders from Khrushchev not to fire on American aircraft without explicit authorization from Moscow. The communication delay between Havana and the Kremlin ran somewhere between 4 and 12 hours, depending on encryption requirements and atmospheric conditions affecting HF radio. An RF-8A Crusader at 450 knots crosses the entire island of Cuba in about 8 minutes. By the time Moscow could have authorized engagement, the Crusader was back over international waters, its film canisters containing evidence that would reshape the next 13 days of human history. The SA-2 operators watched it go. Their radar screens showed nothing useful at that altitude, and their missiles sat on their launchers, oriented skyward, waiting for targets that flew where targets were supposed to fly. The Crusader did not fly where it was supposed to fly. There is no evidence of any organized combat force in Cuba from any combatant country. Sherman Kent, chairman of the Board of National Estimates, wrote that assessment on September 19, 1962. Kent was not a fool. He ran the analytical arm of the CIA with a rigor that bordered on academic obsession. The man had been a Yale history professor before joining the intelligence community, and he brought a historian's caution about unsupported claims. His assessment reflected the consensus view at Langley. The Soviets had never deployed offensive nuclear weapons outside their own territory. Why would they start now, on an island 90 miles from Florida, where the strategic risk was catastrophic and the logistical challenge absurd? Colonel John Wright at the Defense Intelligence Agency thought the assessment was wrong. Wright had been tracking Soviet shipping to Cuba since midsummer. The cargo manifests didn't add up. Ships riding high in the water on the outbound journey from Black Sea ports, meaning heavy cargo. The same ships returning low and light. Soviet deck crews covering certain cargo with tarps in tropical heat, where no tarp was needed for weather protection. Port access at Mariel restricted to Soviet personnel only. Cuban dock workers turned away from their own harbor. Wright flagged this to his superiors in August. His analysis suggested the Soviets were moving something to Cuba they didn't want anyone to see, and the shipping patterns were consistent with large military equipment, possibly missiles. DIA forwarded Wright's concerns. The CIA's response was polite and dismissive. John McCone, the director of Central Intelligence, had his own suspicions. On August 10th, he sent a memo to Kennedy suggesting the Soviets might be installing medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. McCone was on his honeymoon in France at the time. He literally wrote the warning from Cap Ferrat. The memo landed at the White House and generated no meaningful action. McCone sent follow-up cables. The cables acquired a nickname within the agency, the honeymoon telegrams. The name tells you how seriously people took them. This is what irritates me. McCone was right. Wright was right. The refugee reports flooding into Miami Station from Cubans fleeing the island, many of those were right too. Cuban émigrés described long convoys of canvas-covered trucks moving at night on roads cleared of civilian traffic. They described Soviet soldiers in areas previously occupied only by Cuban military. Others reported objects on trailers that looked like very large telephone poles. Telephone poles. That's what an SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile looks like on a transport trailer if you don't know what you're looking at. A 73-foot telephone pole. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence. The problem was an analytical framework that had already decided the answer. Kent's Board of National Estimates operated on the reasonable assumption that Khrushchev was a rational actor who would not take a step so provocative it risked direct nuclear confrontation. The assumption was correct about Khrushchev's general rationality, but catastrophically wrong about his specific calculus in the autumn of 1962. Khrushchev believed, with some justification after the Bay of Pigs, after Operation Mongoose, after the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, that the Americans intended to invade Cuba regardless. The missiles were a deterrent. From Moscow's perspective, the deployment was defensive. Kent's team couldn't see that because they were analyzing Soviet behavior through American strategic logic. A reasonable mistake, nearly a fatal one. The U-2 overflight that finally confirmed the missiles happened on October 14th. Major Richard Heiser flew the mission a single pass over western Cuba at 72,000 feet. The film went to the National Photographic Interpretation Center in a nondescript building on M Street in Washington. Arthur Lundell's photo interpreters had it on their light tables by the evening of October 15th. Lundell's people found the missiles in the first hour. The next morning, McGeorge Bundy walked into Kennedy's bedroom and told him the Soviets had put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Kennedy had been reading the morning papers. The sun was coming through the windows of the White House residence. It was October 16th, a Tuesday, and the world had 13 days of breathable air left in it, though nobody knew the number yet. McCone's honeymoon telegrams didn't look so amusing anymore. Commander William Ecker picked up the phone at Naval Air Station Jacksonville on the evening of October 22nd. The voice on the other end belonged to his commanding officer, and the order was simple in language and staggering in implication. VFP-62 would fly low-level photographic reconnaissance over Cuba beginning the next morning. Mission altitude, 200 feet. Ecker's squadron had trained for low-level work. They were good at it. But training runs over the Florida Keys and training runs over an island bristling with SA-2 batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and 42,000 Soviet troops are different categories of experience entirely. The mission profile called for pairs of RF-8As, a lead aircraft and a wingman, approaching Cuba from the north at high altitude, then descending to treetop level before crossing the coastline. The descent had to be fast. Soviet radar operators would track the Crusaders on approach, and the window between the aircraft dropping below radar coverage and reaching the target sites was measured in seconds, not minutes. Any hesitation in the dive, any navigation error that added 30 seconds to the ingress, and the anti-aircraft crews would have time to depress their guns and acquire a visual solution. The pilots were unarmed. The RF-8A carried cameras where other Crusaders carried cannons. If a MiG-21 scrambled from San Antonio de los Baños airfield, and the Soviets had roughly 40 MiG-21s on Cuba, the Crusaders' only option was to outrun it. At low altitude, in a straight line, the RF-8A could manage about 560 knots. The MiG-21 could do better. Not by much, but enough. Ecker briefed his pilots that night. 6 crews for the first wave. The targets were the confirmed MRBM sites at San Cristobal and the suspected IRBM sites at Guanajay. Each pilot received a strip map showing the run-in heading, the pull-up point, and the recovery route back over water. The maps included the locations of known SAM sites marked in red circles. The red circles were everywhere. One detail from that briefing sticks out. Ecker told his pilots that if they took ground fire, they were not to deviate from the planned camera run. The photographs were more important than the aircraft, more important, by clear implication, than the men flying them. Nobody in the room argued the point. The first launch was set for dawn. 5:30 a.m., October 23rd. NAS, Key West. The sun wasn't up yet, but the flight line was lit white under portable floods. 2 RF-8As sat on the tarmac with their engines already turning, the J-57s producing that distinctive low whine that Crusader crews called the moan. Commander Ecker was in the lead aircraft. Lieutenant Bruce Wilhelmi had the wing. The mission designation was Blue Moon. Somebody at Sinclair had picked the name, and the records don't indicate why. It stuck. Every low-level reconnaissance sortie over Cuba for the duration of the crisis would carry that designator, and by the end of October, there would be dozens of them. But this first pair, Blue Moon 1 and Blue Moon 2, carried a weight the later missions wouldn't. Nobody knew if the Soviets would shoot. Ecker taxied to the runway at 5:45 a.m. The pre-flight brief had been short. Ingress heading 180 degrees, straight south across the Florida Straits. Descend to 200 feet before reaching the Cuban coast. Cross the beach at San Cristobal. Cameras hot. Fly the programmed track over the MRBM sites. then pull up and egress north over the straits at maximum speed. Total time over Cuban airspace, approximately 4 minutes. The route had been planned to avoid the densest SAM concentrations, though avoid is generous language when 24 SA-2 sites are packed onto an island 780 miles long and 120 miles wide at its widest point. Wilhelmy would fly 500 feet to Ecker's right and slightly behind. Both aircraft would run cameras simultaneously. Overlapping coverage. If one plane's film was bad, the others might save the mission. If one plane didn't come back, the others still had the photographs. They launched at 5:55 a.m. Gear up, flaps up. Climb to 25,000 feet for the transit south. At that altitude, Soviet radar on Cuba would paint them clearly. 2 contacts, heading south, speed consistent with tactical jets. The radar operators at the SA-2 sites near Havana would have seen them. The Fansong tracking radars could acquire a target at ranges exceeding 60 miles. Ecker and Wilhelmy were visible for roughly 15 minutes on the inbound leg. Then they pushed over. The descent from 25,000 feet to 200 feet in an RF-8A takes less than 2 minutes if you do it aggressively. Ecker did it aggressively. The altimeter unwound so fast, it was essentially useless below 1,000 feet. At that point, you flew by looking out the canopy, judging height against the water, then against the approaching treeline. The Crusader's variable incidence wing was cranked to its low-speed setting for the camera run, which changed the aircraft's handling characteristics in ways that the manual described as requiring pilot attention. Understatement from Vought's engineering department. At 200 feet over the water, the 2 Crusaders crossed the Cuban coastline at 6:14 a.m. Ecker saw the missile sites almost immediately. The Soviet construction crews had not been subtle. Freshly bulldozed clearings in the palm forest, red Cuban soil exposed in geometric patterns that screamed military engineering, cable trenches, prefabricated buildings, and the missiles themselves, or rather the transporters, long canvas-shrouded shapes on MAZ-543 vehicles, parked in the star-shaped revetments that were standard Soviet field deployment practice. Penkovsky had described these layouts in his intelligence reports. The CIA had built mock-ups from his descriptions. Ecker was looking at the real thing from a distance where he could practically read the markings on the equipment. Cameras running, all 5 stations firing, the Ka-45s in the nose capturing the forward view, while the lateral Ka-46s swept the flanks. Film advancing at a rate that would produce thousands of individual frames over the 4-minute run. Wilhelmy off to the right, his cameras covering the same sites from a slightly different angle, stereo pairs that the photo interpreters at NPIC would later use to calculate the precise dimensions of every object on the ground. Soviet personnel looked up. A few ran, but most just stood there motionless, watching. One photograph from this mission, later declassified, shows a Soviet soldier staring directly at the camera from perhaps 150 feet below. His face is a pale oval, his body foreshortened by the angle, his shadow stretching behind him in the early morning light. He did not fire. Nobody fired. Ecker completed his camera run, pulled the Crusader's nose up, and climbed hard to the north. Wilhelmy followed. They were back over international waters by 6:18 a.m. 4 minutes of Cuban airspace, thousands of frames of film, 0 rounds fired in either direction. The film canisters were on a transport aircraft to NPIC before Ecker had finished his debrief at Key West. Arthur Lundahl's team would have the processed images on their light tables by early afternoon. What they found in those photographs would land on Kennedy's desk before dinner. Imagery so detailed that the president could count individual missile transporters and see the shadows cast by Soviet technicians walking between them. The U-2 had found the crisis. Blue Moon was going to manage it. Dino Brugioni pulled the first processed negatives from the dryer at NPIC and held them to the light. The frames were dense with information. palm trees, roads, vehicles, shadows, all rendered in the hyper-sharp grain of the KA-45's 12-inch focal length lens. From 200 feet, the resolution was absurd. Individual tent pegs were visible. Tire tracks in the mud told you which direction a truck had driven that morning. The U-2 imagery from October 14th had been good enough to confirm the missiles existed. Blue Moon imagery was good enough to count the lug nuts on the transporter wheels. That difference mattered more than it sounds. Kennedy's XCOM needed to know not just that there were missiles in Cuba, but exactly how many at what stage of readiness and how quickly they could be launched. The U-2 flying at 72,000 feet could answer the first question. Only the RF-8As flying at 200 feet could answer the other two. Brugione's team worked through the night of October 23rd into the 24th, frame by frame, light table to light table. Each analyst had a specific assignment. One team on the San Cristobal MRBM complex, another on Guanajay, another scanning for previously unidentified sites. They used stereoscopic viewers to extract three-dimensional information from the overlapping coverage Ecker and Wilhelmi had provided. A cable trench that looked like a scratch on a single frame became a measurable object with depth and direction when viewed in stereo. Shadow lengths, combined with the known sun angle at 6:14 a.m., gave precise heights of every vertical structure on the sites. The trigonometry was straightforward. What it meant for the XCOM was something else entirely. What the analysts found: 24 SS-4 launchers at San Cristobal in various stages of operational readiness, 16 SS-5 launchers under construction at Guanajay, nuclear warhead storage bunkers, identifiable by their distinctive earth-bermed construction and the security fencing around them, at both complexes. Lundahl's briefing to the XCOM on October 25th included a detail pulled directly from the Blue Moon film. Soviet technicians had been photographed in the act of mating a warhead section to a missile airframe. Active assembly, the briefing document called it. The SS-4 had a range of 1,020 nautical miles. Washington was 1,100 miles from San Cristobal. The SS-5 could reach 2,200. That put every American city east of Montana inside the targeting envelope. Over the 13 days, VFP-62 and its Air Force counterparts would shoot roughly 168,000 frames of Cuban reconnaissance film. 168,000 data points. 168,000 pieces of leverage. At the Pentagon, Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2 at 10 a.m. on October 24th. The only time in history. Every B-52 in the inventory was either airborne or cocked on alert with engines running, loaded with thermonuclear weapons. The SAC commander, General Thomas Power, broadcast the DEFCON 2 order in the clear. Uncoded on open frequencies, he wanted Moscow to hear it. 14 blocks away in the basement of the White House, the photographs were spread across the conference table. Kennedy had seen the U-2 takes days earlier. Those images required interpretation. An analyst had to stand beside the president and point to grainy shapes, explain that this smudge was a launcher and that line was a cable trench. The Blue Moon photographs needed no interpreter. Kennedy picked up a print from the San Cristobal complex and stared at it for a long time without speaking. You could see the rivets on the missile transporters. You could see a technician's shadow falling across an open warhead canister. Robert Kennedy later wrote that the room went quiet when the prints came out. It was as if the missiles had moved from an abstraction to something terribly, physically real. The XCOM had been arguing for days about the appropriate response. The Joint Chiefs wanted an airstrike followed by invasion. McNamara favored the naval blockade, which they were calling a quarantine, because blockade is technically an act of war under international law, and the lawyers in the room cared about that distinction, even if nobody else did. Adlai Stevenson wanted to negotiate. Curtis LeMay wanted to bomb Cuba back to the Pleistocene, which was more or less his default position on everything. Abstract intelligence estimates hadn't broken the deadlock. The Blue Moon imagery did. The photographs told Kennedy something the U-2s couldn't. The SS-4 sites at San Cristobal were approaching operational status. Fuel trucks were positioned, oxidizer trailers were connected. The launch pads showed scorch marks from what appeared to be engine tests. But the SS-5 sites at Guanajay were weeks from completion. The concrete pads weren't poured. The erector equipment hadn't arrived. Kennedy could see this himself. He didn't need a briefer to translate. The timeline was visible in the dirt. This meant the window for a diplomatic solution was narrow, but it existed. An invasion, which the Joint Chiefs estimated would require 7 days of air operations, followed by an amphibious assault involving 120,000 Marines, would almost certainly trigger launches from the operational SS-4 sites before American forces could overrun them. The Blue Moon photos showed those sites were ready. An invasion meant accepting nuclear detonations on American soil. The blockade bought time to negotiate removal of the missiles before the SS-5 sites came online and doubled the threat. Kennedy chose the blockade. The photographs were not the only factor, but McNamara later said they were the decisive one. "We could see what we were dealing with," he told an interviewer in 1987. "Not estimates, not projections. The actual state of readiness, on a given day, at a given hour." On October 25th, Lundahl brought a new set of Blue Moon prints to the Situation Room. Comparison with the previous day's coverage showed additional camouflage netting over the San Cristobal sites. The Soviets were hiding the missiles. Kennedy studied the before and after pairs, then asked a question that Brugioni recorded in his notes. "Can we tell if they're still assembling warheads under the netting?" Brugioni's answer was no. The netting blocked visual observation, but thermal signatures from the camera film suggested activity underneath. Vehicle exhaust, possibly generator heat. The intelligence was degrading. The Soviets were adapting. VFP-62 would need to fly again tomorrow. Lower if possible. The order went back to Key West before midnight. Film from the October 26th sortie showed something new at San Cristobal. The oxidizer trailers had moved, not forward toward the launch pads, backward toward the access roads. Brugioni flagged it, but cautioned against reading too much into a single data point. Trucks move for all kinds of reasons. October 27th was the worst day. Major Rudolph Anderson, flying a U-2 over eastern Cuba, took an SA-2 at 72,000 feet. The missile detonated close enough to shred his pressure suit and pierce the cockpit. Anderson died somewhere above Baines. He was the only combat fatality of the crisis, and his death nearly ended the world. The ex-com spent hours debating whether to retaliate against the SAM site that killed him. Kennedy held. The Blue Moon flights continued that same afternoon, their pilots now fully aware that the Soviets had graduated from watching to shooting. The RF-8As stayed at 200 feet. The SA-2 that killed Anderson couldn't touch them down there. Small consolation when you're also within range of a conscript with a rifle. Khrushchev's letter arrived on October 28th. Radio Moscow broadcast it at 9 a.m. Washington time. The missiles would be withdrawn. The language was face-saving. References to American pledges not to invade Cuba, mutual respect, the preservation of peace. But the substance was unambiguous. The SS-4s and SS-5s were coming out. Kennedy's first question after the broadcast was about verification. How would the United States confirm the Soviets were actually dismantling the sites and not just covering them with more netting? The answer was already taxing at Key West. Blue Moon sorties shifted from threat assessment to compliance monitoring overnight. The mission profiles didn't change much. Same altitudes, same camera configurations, same 4-minute dashes across the Cuban landscape. What changed was what the cameras saw. On October 30th, VFP-62 pilots photographed Soviet soldiers disassembling the erector launchers at San Cristobal. the star-shaped revetments that had appeared in Ecker's first photographs 7 days earlier were being bulldozed flat. Missile transporters, the same MAZ-543s that had been parked under camouflage netting, were now lined up on the road to Mariel Harbor, uncovered, pointed toward the port. The Soviets wanted the cameras to see them leaving. By November 5th, the Blue Moon film showed empty pads at every previously identified MRBM site. The cable trenches were filled in, the warhead storage bunkers stripped bare. 42 SS-4 missiles were loaded onto the deck of the freighter Kasimov at Mariel, and an RF-8A photographed each one from 200 feet as the ship pulled away from the dock. The analysts at NPIC counted them individually against their inventory list. The numbers matched. I think this gets overlooked. The same aircraft that identified the threat confirmed its removal. Without that confirmation, Kennedy had a Soviet promise and nothing else. The RF-8A film gave him proof. Ecker landed at Key West after his final Blue Moon sortie on November 10th and walked to the debrief room without saying much. His logbook showed 12 low-level combat missions over Cuba in 19 days. Wilhelmy had flown nearly as many. Between them, the pilots of VFP-62 had accumulated more combat reconnaissance hours in 3 weeks than most squadrons logged in a year. Nobody gave them a parade. The Navy awarded Ecker and Wilhelmy the Distinguished Flying Cross. A few other pilots received air medals. The citations were classified for years, standard procedure when the missions themselves were still sensitive. VFP-62 went back to Jacksonville, resumed training flights over Florida swampland, and waited for the next crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis entered the history books as a story about Kennedy and Khrushchev, diplomacy and brinksmanship, the naval quarantine line, and the ships that turned back and the ships that didn't. The men who flew 200 feet over nuclear warheads at 600 miles per hour became footnotes. This irritates me more than it should. The diplomatic histories describe the crisis as a chess match between two leaders, and that framing isn't wrong exactly, but it leaves out the part where the chess pieces were actual human beings strapped into aluminum airframes with no weapons and no ejection plan that made any sense at treetop altitude. An RF-8A pilot punching out at 200 feet and 450 knots is not surviving. Everyone involved understood the math. Anyway, what VFP-62 proved over Cuba became doctrine. The low-level tactical reconnaissance mission, fast, low daylight, cameras instead of weapons, went from being a niche capability that most air planners treated as an afterthought to a core requirement baked into every operational plan the Pentagon produced for the next 3 decades. In Vietnam, RF-8As from VFP-63 flew the same profile over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, same altitude, same cameras, different jungle. The losses were worse. 31 Crusaders went down over Southeast Asia, and the distinction between reconnaissance and combat meant nothing to the gunners on the ground. The RF-4C Phantom eventually replaced the Crusader in the Air Force inventory, carrying better cameras, more film, improved navigation systems, a real inertial platform, but flying the same suicidal altitude profiles that Ecker had validated over San Cristobal. By Desert Storm in 1991, the RF-4Cs were still at it, screaming across the Iraqi desert at 200 feet, while F-15ES operated comfortably at 20,000. The reconnaissance pilots had a saying that sources attribute to VFP-62, but nobody can pin to a specific person. Unarmed and unafraid. The second part was a lie, and everyone knew it. There's a detail from Ecker's post-war interviews that stays with me. He described the moment on his first Blue Moon sortie when he crossed the Cuban coastline and dropped to mission altitude. The mangrove swamp blurred into a green wall on either side of the canopy. He could see individual palm fronds bending in his jet wash. A flock of white birds, egrets he thought, exploded upward from a lagoon directly beneath him. and for a fraction of a second, the canopy was full of wings. Then the MRBM sight appeared in his windscreen, and he was over it and past it before his hands finished the camera activation sequence. 4 minutes, San Cristobal to the coast. The entire photographic run that changed American nuclear strategy lasted less time than it takes to boil an egg. Ecker retired as a captain in 1974. He didn't write a memoir. In Tyuratam, on the frozen steppe of Kazakhstan, Soviet engineers spent the better part of 2 decades building the most elaborate air defense network in human history. By the mid-1980s, the Vought, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, operated over 9,000 surface-to-air missile launchers, 2,500 interceptor aircraft, and a radar network so dense that coverage overlapped 3 and 4 layers deep across the entire Western Soviet frontier. The system employed over 500,000 personnel. Its sole organizing purpose, from the day Gary Powers went down in 1960 to the day the Berlin Wall fell, was to prevent American eyes from seeing what the Soviet Union was doing on its own territory. It didn't work. The U-2 flew over the Soviet Union for 4 years before Powers was shot down, and in those 4 years, American cameras mapped every ICBM site, every bomber base, every submarine pen the Soviets had built or were building. When the SA-2 finally caught Powers at 70,000 feet, the CIA already had the Corona satellite program running. Corona's first successful mission returned more photographic coverage of the Soviet Union in a single pass than all 24's U-2 overflights combined. The Soviets built a defense against the airplane. The Americans had already moved to space. Then came the SR-71. Mach 3.2 at 85,000 feet. The Soviets fired over 4,000 missiles at Blackbirds during the program's operational life. The hit count was 0. The Vought entire architecture, the interceptors, the SAM belts, the overlapping radar fans, had been designed to kill aircraft flying at 70,000 feet and below. The SR-71 operated above the engagement envelope of every weapon the Soviets possessed. By the time they developed missiles capable of reaching 85,000 feet, the satellite constellation had matured to the point where the SR-71 was a bonus, not a necessity. The pattern is worth stating plainly. At every stage of the Cold War, the United States maintained the ability to look at whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted. The Soviets could not do the same. Their satellite reconnaissance program lagged by years. Their human networks inside American defense programs were good, sometimes exceptional. But a spy can steal a blueprint, not a photograph of a missile field taken 6 hours ago. The asymmetry was structural and persistent, and it shaped everything that followed. Blue Moon sits at the hinge point of that asymmetry. October 1962 was the moment when American photographic intelligence stopped being a strategic luxury and became an operational weapon. The U-2 photographs told Kennedy the missiles existed. The RF-8A photographs told him what to do about them. The distinction mattered. It was the difference between knowing you have a problem and understanding the problem well enough to solve it without starting a thermonuclear war. There's a Soviet General Staff document from 1963, partially declassified in the 1990s, that assessed the failure in Cuba. The word that recurs throughout the analysis is transparency. The complaint that Soviet forces on the island had been rendered, in their phrase, operationally transparent to American intelligence. They couldn't hide. They tried camouflage netting, and it bought them maybe 48 hours before the next sortie flew lower with better film. The entire deception effort collapsed because a handful of Navy pilots in unarmed Crusaders kept coming back, flying the same impossible profiles and feeding NPIC the raw material it needed to build a complete picture. The Soviets drew the obvious conclusion. They poured resources into concealment, deception, underground construction, mobile launchers, an entire doctrine of hiding, built specifically to defeat the kind of photographic surveillance that had exposed them in Cuba. They got better at it. Substantially better. By the 1980s, Soviet ICBMs rode mobile TELs through forests on unpredictable patrol routes, and American satellites struggled to maintain reliable tracking. But the Cold War didn't end because one side outhid the other. It ended because one side's economy collapsed under the weight of trying to maintain strategic parity with a nation that could see everything it built. The reconnaissance advantage didn't just provide intelligence, it drove cost. Every Soviet concealment program, every deception measure, every hardened silo and mobile launcher was a tax levied by American cameras. The decoy warheads alone consumed resources that might have kept factories running another year. The bill came due in 1991. On December 26th of that year, a KH-11 satellite passed over Turatam and photographed the sprawling PVO Strany command complex. The imagery analyst at the National Reconnaissance Office who processed the take noted in her report that several radar arrays appeared to be unpowered. She flagged it, logged it, and moved on to the next file.